Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for spending your Thursday morning with us. These weekly webinars called COVID-19 Conversations are brought to you by the African Alliance with support from the South African Medical Research Council and the Department of Science and Innovation, as well as the Vaccine Advocacy Resource Group, an independently funded group of vaccine advocates who work globally to ensure that vaccine research is accountable, community-owned, and transparent. These weekly webinars are brought to you in collaboration with the Community Constituency COVID-19 Front, the Treatment Action Campaign, and APHA. COVID-19 Conversations seek to ensure that civil society is kept up to date on the latest COVID-19 research, strengthen the culture of accountability between researchers and civil society, and contribute to shared learning and unlearning in the research sector as it relates to COVID-19. Today, colleagues, we are joined by Fatima Hassan. Fatima is a South African human rights lawyer and social justice activist. She's the founder of and heads the newly established Health Justice Initiative in South Africa and is the former executive director of the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, heading the foundation for 6 years. She has dedicated her professional life to defending and promoting human rights in South Africa, especially in the field of HIV and AIDS, where she worked for the AIDS Law Project and also acted for the Treatment Action Campaign in many of its legal cases. She has a BA and LLB from the University of the Witwatersrand and an LLM from Duke University. She clerked at the Constitutional Court of South Africa for Justice Kate O'Regan and has served as a special advisor to the former Minister Barbara Hogan. She is the former co-director and founding trustee of Ndifuna Ukwazi and previously served on the boards of the Raith Foundation, SA Medecins Sans Frontières, the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition, and the South African Council for Medical Schemes. She is currently serving on the board of Global Witness. The recipient of several fellowships and awards, including the Franklin Thomas SA Constitutional Court Fellowship and the Tom and Andi Bernstein Distinguished Human Rights Fellowship at Yale University School of Law. She has published and writes on issues related to social justice and HIV and AIDS access to medicines. She's also the host of a special COVID-19 and IP-related podcast called Access. Today, colleagues, Fatima will share with us an overview of her work, some of the key access issues and developments we should have top of mind, and engage with us for the last 30 minutes of this hour on issues of access, justice, and accountability of research, pharma and science, and how all of these issues have created the perfect storm for opportunities for profiteering, politicking, and power plays that will have a direct impact on communities and whether or not a COVID-19 vaccine will be within reach of those who need it most. Fatima, thank you for joining us and welcome to this week's COVID-19 conversation. Over to you.
Thanks, Tian. And I think now everybody knows how old I am. So I feel very embarrassed, but also very humbled to be with all of you on this chat. I did think that there would be hundreds and hundreds of people on it because I think it's one of the most pressing issues around how inequality is going to play out, not just in our country, but in the region and globally. And so, you know, I am concerned that maybe we have COVID-19 fatigue and people assume that something's going to happen which is going to be positive, which is going to result in them getting access like we did with HIV/AIDS, but that may not necessarily be the case. So yeah, so great to be here.
Thanks, Fatima. So I'll hand over to you now for the first 30 minutes to give us an overview of where you come from, what are the issues you're working on now, and why are you working on those issues, and why do they speak to you?
Thanks. And I see one of my advisory group members, Els, is actually on this call. So it's great to have my reference advisory group on the call. So basically, I mean, Tian, as you know, I was on sabbatical earlier this year, and the idea was just to really take a break from doing all of this work for many, many years. And in the middle of my sabbatical, COVID-19 happened. And I think that was sort of an awakening moment for me. And I have explained this in previous interviews, but the idea was really to kind of anticipate what would happen in terms of access in relation to COVID-19 and its intersection with TB and HIV, and learning from our past experience. And that's the moment when I spoke to a number of people who I've worked with previously and people who come from different sectors, from law, economics, community activism, health, IP experts, and we decided to set up the Health Justice Initiative. And that's why I have this really large, amazing reference advisory group and which I think the Health Justice Initiative is really fortunate to have. So there's clinicians on it, there's lawyers on it, there's former judges on it, there's activists on it, and people both from South Africa and elsewhere. So that allowed us to set up the organization, which really, when people say, what does the Health Justice Initiative do? I say, well, that's it. That's what we do, health justice. And we try and address issues of health injustice. And obviously with COVID-19, the immediate focus, but there'll obviously be a longer term plan as well. The immediate focus is around access to interventions that can actually prevent ill health and interventions that can actually save your life if you are infected with a chronic condition, whether it's COVID, whether it's TB, whether it's HIV. And I think the particular niche of the Health Justice Initiative for now has to be around issues of how power and politics and patterns intersect to make access even more difficult to achieve. And that's in relation to how medicines are priced, how they are priced out of reach for ordinary people, for vulnerable people, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world. So while it may seem like a complex issue, it's actually quite a simple issue. Intellectual property and patents are simple issues that are made complex by an industry that is bent on profiteering and is made difficult by government officials who find the entire global system and the geopolitical system so difficult to navigate because there's so many different political actors and players involved, that over time access becomes more complex unnecessarily, and access becomes even more difficult. And here I'm talking in relation to the medicine pricing framework. And for us, really what we're trying to do is to show this immediate need around COVID. The way in which this is playing out is the way in which every other disease and illness plays out. And it's the reason why we waited more than 10 years for access to life-saving ARVs. It's the reason why most of my clients died prematurely when we were doing HIV/AIDS work. It's the reason why we took our government to court. It's the reason why we took pharmaceutical companies to court, because I can guarantee you that nobody's going to be benevolent here. Nobody's going to be charitable here. This is a ruse to make excessive profit. And I feel very strongly about that. And I feel that our past experience with HIV/AIDS can show that and can confirm that and can justify why we are very concerned that in 12 or 24 months' time, if there is a successful vaccine, we're not going to be first in line. And if we are able to access it, we're just going to have to pay a lot of money that this country does not have, money that this country should be using for other purposes and for other needs. So over to you, Tian. You mustn't get me started talking on intellectual property and how we had to deal with this in HIV/AIDS, because I can talk for hours on this. So.
No worries. Thanks for that overview. Fatima, I think you touched on a few interesting things. I mean, one of the first questions that comes up is, what similarities are you seeing now between the access issues, the work with pharma, the calls for accountability and transparency around HIV to COVID? Is it basically exactly the same, or are you seeing some differences in terms of how the maneuvering and the politicking is happening?
So, I've been thinking about this. In some respects, I think it's worse, right? Because we started out this pandemic and globally this declaration of a public health emergency and multiple lockdowns in so many parts of the world, and rapid infections and rapid hospitalization, and then rapid, over 1 million people within months have been estimated globally to have already died of COVID-related illnesses. So we thought that, well, this is the one time where people will act differently, because everybody was expressing immediate solidarity. They saw the socioeconomic impact of this pandemic. So I really anticipated that it was going to be very different, at least for the first few weeks. But quite soon already by March, we'd been, cautioning and issuing the warning bell that if you don't watch multiple processes and systems, the same thing would happen. And in fact, it would be worse. Because what you have is a situation where people are taking advantage of a very immediate life and death situation and a very immediate economic need situation, because it's basically crippled the global economy, right? I mean, the various lockdowns and the fact that there is no vaccine as yet, the fact that there is no effective treatment as yet. There's only dexamethasone and oxygen for, you know, hospitalized patients or severely ill patients. So we really anticipate that the response would be different because people were saying that. But as often in the health space and in relation to the development and production and research of vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics, what we saw quite early on was this very intricate, very smart maneuvering around how to extract as much profit as possible. So we'll give little concessions here and there, we'll give you maybe a license, we'll agree to a no profit fee in that part of the world, but not that part of the world. And so very early on, like with HIV/AIDS, we saw that people were trying to play God. So sorry, apologies to the atheists. But what you have is the equivalent of a drug company that is an unelected structure, or a multilateral institution that is not elected by people, that is not accountable to anybody, that has either a group of shareholders or a group of advisory board members making decisions that will have an impact on the rest of the world, which is difficult to hold them to account, because when you want to hold the pharmaceutical industry to account, you have to do that in each country, you have to do that regionally, you have to do that at the WTO. And so despite what people were saying, despite what CEOs were saying, and presidents and prime ministers and government officials, and a whole, you know, what officials at multilateral institutions from WHO to UNAIDS to Gavi to a range of different institutions were saying, we weren't seeing, you know, Els always used to say to me, you know, from March already, where are the written assurances? We're relying on a press statement, we're relying on charity, but where is the written assurance? Where is the written agreement? Because without what we've learned from HIV/AIDS is without something in writing, without a firm commitment to affordable access, to proper allocation, to equitable allocation, you're not going to get it. We'll be fighting for the next 10 years just to try and get a fair price. We'll be fighting for the next few years just to try and have a fair allocation framework. And I think, you know, when you asked what are the similarities, no transparency, very little transparency and accountability. So in the middle of a pandemic, within a space of a few months, we already have activists around the world having to do access to information applications, having to litigate, having to make demands on different governments to say, what have you agreed to on our behalf? What have you done? What have you not done? Because remember, in South Africa, there's also a state duty to do something that it hasn't as yet done. It's, you know, its omission is costing lives, or its positive action is costing lives. So the similarities are there, and the similarities, Tian, for me, the most is, you know, and why it's weird, it's kind of fallen on the laps of former HIV/AIDS activists to do a lot of this ringing the bell and doing this work, because we've had experience with these companies. A lot of these companies are the same companies that we've had to deal with on HIV/AIDS, and even, you know, other activists have had to deal with in TB. So we don't necessarily feel there's a good track record. It's not all of a sudden with COVID, you're going to become this, you know, organization or pharmaceutical company that is so committed to transparency and so committed to the public good that you're not interested in making lots of profit in the quickest way possible. You're not all of a sudden going to become a drug company which says to the US government or the UK government, hang on, if you order 100 million doses of the vaccine in advance for something that hasn't even yet been proven to be effective, what about the countries in the South? What about low and middle income countries? No, those are not the conversations that are happening. So I think that, I think we were right already to be concerned early on, and I think we are right. And my concerns when you said, well, what, you know, earlier we were talking about, like, well, what worries you and what keeps you up at night, is that we've got a limited period of time and we need to up the ante, because in 12 months or 24 months, when the vaccine actually is a reality, we hope, and potentially could be available, we need to know, what are we going to have to pay for it? How will it be rolled out? What's the manufacturing capacity in the region, and particularly in Africa, and then obviously in the rest of the global South? And who's profiteering from this? So I think that the conversations around corruption and around PPE and around government's role in that are fair and legitimate and necessary, because we do live in a country where there's just been a rampant rampage of state resources. But equally so, we need to be having conversations around what is the role of those people who broker power. And so early on when you said, who are the players that broker power? So, I mean, it's obvious that it's our government, it's the pharmaceutical industry, and it's multilateral institutions, I think, and funders and donors, which have a lot of influence in these processes. So at the moment, if you say to me, well, who are the role players? I'll give you like this long list, because it's so convoluted, and there's diagnostics, there's vaccines, there's treatment. I mean, there's PPE. So there's so many different components to COVID, and there's so many different, if you want to call it, audit trails. I mean, there's over 200 vaccine research candidates. So asking a global community of civil society to keep track of each of those 200 vaccine candidates, that's just vaccine candidates, the transparency elements, the access terms, the research protocols, the prior access agreements, advanced purchasing agreements. I mean, you've seen reports by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty, by Oxfam. I mean, everybody is trying to keep up to speed, and things change so fast. I mean, the goalposts are moving so fast. And I think that, you know, sorry, I'm going in circles, but that's one of the differences with HIV/AIDS, is that never, and you know, somebody on our advisory group who's a well-respected clinician has said this over and over again, this is unprecedented. It's unprecedented, the scale and pace of research and the volume of research that is going into one disease, right? And of course, the global players have decided that that's what's necessary and important, because I can just transmit COVID to you very easily without a mask and without hand washing, and it's crippling economies. So there are also vested interests in making sure that something can actually be developed for the market to make sure that people can reopen the economy and reopen their livelihoods. So I think there's the real thing that concerns me, and the biggest difference with HIV/AIDS, and I see questions coming up on the chat group, and you'll have to help me there, Tian, is the pace and the scale. I mean, we are dedicated unit trying to focus on this, and we can't keep up to speed. So I don't know how we expect community activists and vulnerable groups and communities and people who work on health access generally to be demanding a whole range of things, from transparency and accountability, which, by the way, I think in South Africa we do not have enough of. And we can come back to that later. And I think that our government is failing us on the transparency and accountability in relation to at least the 3 clinical trials that are currently being conducted in South Africa, and we can return to those issues. But yeah, just keeping a track of everything that is happening does concern me, because we don't know which of the vaccine candidate is going to be successful. I don't know if you've seen any documents, but I certainly haven't. There's been lots of press briefings on chickens and open-toe shoes and all those kind of things, which frankly is, for me, not the material things. I want a press briefing on, you've set up all these MACs, you've got all these advisory committees. We know there's going to be a problem of supply. We know there's going to be a problem of manufacturing capacity. We know there's going to be a problem of fair pricing or affordable pricing. We have our government trying to mitigate all of that by doing different things in Geneva and doing different things at the AU, and you know, credit to them for that. But I want to know from my government, have you sat down and discussed what you're going to do with scarce resources and scarce supplies? Who will get the vaccine first? Tian, is it going to be you? Or is it going to be your dad over 65? Or is it going to be the healthcare worker? Or is it going to be the security guard? Or is it going to be the train driver? And so I think all these issues around inequity and equity and equitable allocation, these are the hard decisions we're going to have to make. And if the trend is going to be that somebody is going to sit with a few people behind the scenes and you can never release those deliberations, and the MAC people get fired for having a different view, then that's not a good trend around transparency and accountability. So, you know, let me stop there, and then we can come back later to the issues of how power is brokered in the intellectual property and pricing framework.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Fatima. I mean, as you're speaking, and we'll shortly move away from some of the historical comparisons, but a question that does come to mind is if you look at all of the work and perhaps resources that were put in around the struggle for treatment, what infrastructure, what policy framework, what baseline are we using today in all of these COVID-related arguments that was put in place when the struggle for treatment happened? Or are we basically starting afresh?
So, I mean, I think the difference is that we have the same constitution. And fortunately for us, we have a constitutional framework and we have Section 27. So I think everything can be rooted in that. And I think that is what sets us apart from many other countries, is that we actually still do have the right to access to healthcare services, which is progressively realized over time. And we can actually, in theory, still go to court and try and have that articulated and try to have that right vindicated in peace. I think what we have, which we didn't have around HIV/AIDS, is perhaps a greater understanding by the public of why treatment is so essential, that it's not just some drug, it's not just some car or a handbag. I think people actually understand the life-saving need and the desperation and the immediacy. And I think the lockdown has shown why fixing our healthcare system, why accessing quality healthcare and life-saving interventions is so critical. And so I think that there is at least a different baseline from which we're working from. I think what also is different, and I think we must take more advantage of it and we must leverage it, is we don't have a denialist president. We don't have a president that does not believe in science and evidence. So tick. Well done. You would think that that's normal, but in South Africa, we actually, have to celebrate that, right? So unlike, for example, the Trump administration or many, the Brazilian government, there's a lot of anti-vaxxers in government, as in government officials. There are people who don't believe that COVID tests are legitimate. They don't believe in the treatment of major chronic conditions. So I think we had that and we know what it was like, and fortunately we don't have to deal with that. So tick, that's done. The difference also, because of that, and because I think, ironically, it's because they're looking at the bottom line and they realize what has happened to the economy, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world, is we started having developing countries, and surprisingly, ironically, I think, the South African government goes to Geneva and starts making submissions, which are quite radical. And I never even anticipated that they would partner with the Indian government, which in itself is politically, regarded as a right-wing nationalist government. But be that as it may, South Africa and India goes and actually asks for a waiver from certain provisions of TRIPS, right? Now in HIV/AIDS, that took so long. That took us years before we even got the Doha Declaration or even some kind of recognition that in a public health emergency, you can dispense with some of the rules around intellectual property and global trade rules so that you can actually either manufacture locally or you can import a cheaper version or you're able to issue compulsory licenses, etc. So for me, that's been quite surprising. And like on the one hand, I feel, okay, well, what is actually going on? Because and sorry, I have to be the one that calls the double standards out, because I think that's the job of the Health Justice Initiative. So we go to Geneva and we make a submission around how patents, our government says this, patents are a key barrier to access life-saving interventions for COVID in Africa, in other developing countries, in South Africa. It's complex, it's difficult to use, the Doha Declarations are hardly being used, etc., etc., etc. And this is the reason why none of us have been able to issue a compulsory license, right? They're saying this as on behalf of governments. And then they go with the Indian government and they say, well, we want a waiver. Now that's quite unprecedented. And one would have thought, and that's why Tia, we're talking about who are the power brokers. Now, one would have thought that everybody's saying that we're going to commit global solidarity to COVID, it's unprecedented, we haven't had a pandemic in 100 years, etc., etc. Of course, the global North governments, and particularly the UK and the US, say no. Even with the scale of the pandemic and even with the scale of the devastation, you won't get your waiver, right? But at home, so, you know, there you're supporting the South African government and you're supporting the Indian government, and you're calling out those governments that are opposing it. And remember that the lobbies that are behind those governments are not taking those decisions because they've done an assessment. They've taken a decision because they've got, you know, very serious vested pharmaceutical interests that they have to protect. And those lobbies are very powerful. There's no way that any one of those drug companies, despite all the public interest commitments that they've made and commitments to global solidarity and no profit periods for limited times, they're not going to agree to a waiver of intellectual property principles during this pandemic. And I think that tells you where we are globally in terms of, you know, what interests matter. And I really think that profits matter then over lives. But locally, our government has done amazing work on the non-pharmaceutical interventions. I think has done right by the science and by the evidence. I think some of the decisions around lockdown were a bit like silly, but I've been saying this since March. They've never once mentioned the drug companies or the pharmaceutical industry. They've mentioned the alcohol industry. They've taken on the tobacco industry. We've had litigation around the hours and the curfews and stuff, but not in this. This one, they're saying this in Geneva, but on this particular industry, locally, they're silent. And I mean, yeah, fine, it's nice to have a press statement and it would be nice for them to talk about it. But what's interesting is we passed regulations, we've extended the disaster declaration, we've passed consumer regulations around pandemic pricing. We haven't expedited the legislative agenda on two things, Tian, which could actually reinforce what you're saying in Geneva and help here. And that's the Patents Act. The Patents Act in South Africa is a huge problem. It's one of our biggest obstacles in access. The Fix the Patents Law campaign has been saying this for years. Cabinet approves the IP policy in 2018. You had this pandemic where Parliament could have expedited this legislative agenda. The DTI could have expedited, but it hasn't. So we are still scared. We are still reluctant. We know the power of this industry. We know it from the PMA case. We know it from a few years ago what tech and other organizations call Pharmagate. So we know there's going to be lots of vested interest, but we're not doing that locally. The second thing that we haven't fixed up or we haven't done is we have, frankly, an incomplete medicine pricing regime in South Africa. To regulate medicine prices, to regulate therapeutics, which includes vaccines, to regulate the price of diagnostics and tests, etc. So we dealing with the pricing of sanitizer and hand wash and face masks, but we're not dealing with the bigger issues around structurally, how are we as a country with obviously impending national health insurance implementation. So I think what this pandemic has basically shown up is all the fault lines. It's showing up all the vested interests, it's showing the double standards, and it's showing this very weird, I mean, I must have, the president has signed on to the People's Vaccine Pledge. He's talking about an AU vaccine roadmap. We're going to Geneva and saying quite radical things, but here we're not doing that. He's never in any of his presidential briefings, remember we had to wait on Sunday nights, like sometimes it'd be very late, but we'd have to wait on Sunday nights during the lockdown and the president would speak to us. And he would talk about a lot of things, but at the heart of managing this epidemic, at the heart of dealing with this is going to be access and it's going to be fair pricing. And that involves dealing with intellectual property and property rights and patent rights. And he hasn't talked about that. So we don't know what is Luthuli House thinking, because you do know that Luthuli House governs the country, not necessarily the ministers. So we don't know what their policy position is on this. We don't know if they would be willing to issue a compulsory license. Is that even territory that'd be willing to go in? Obviously the question, and so I feel for them, because they'll be like, should we issue a compulsory license, but on what? Which, at the moment, what do you issue a compulsory license? 200 potential vaccine candidates, 3 of which are being researched in the country. So I think that the only thing we can do, Tian, is to try and have a sense of what is going on and for all of us to be vigilant in our different lanes, but to make sure that we demand an even higher level of transparency and accountability from our government. It can't be, and I see Laura's on the call, who used to write for Becky Sisa and now writes for a number of publications, including the Mail and Guardian. Poncho has been following this, and Nelly's been following this. But it can't be 7 journalists in the country, again, like we had with HIV/AIDS, and a group of activists that are trying to figure out what's going on. We should be asking much more of our government. And by asking much more, I mean like asking detailed questions about all of their assessments and all of their plans, because ultimately they're making decisions for us, right? And it can't, again, this will be my last point, and I'll come back to you, Tian, is that we can't, again, I mean, we have a new administration. We have a new approach to a whole range of things. We have a president who believes in science. It can't be our job, again, Tian, to fight with the drug companies. I mean, we'll do it. We'll go on the streets if we have to. We'll take them to court. We'll challenge their pricing. But that cannot be our job. We are not, there really has to be a different reckoning. And, earlier on in the pandemic, we said, this is our reckoning moment. And I think we really need to see government step up in that. And similarly, we need activists to hold the pharmaceutical industry to account. And we need the activism on that, because that has shown to have worked, not just here, but elsewhere in the world. Some of the drug companies have actually committed to sharing some of the trial protocols because activists pushed for that, including AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, because obviously these trials are also happening in other sites.
Yeah. It's a lot to think about.
I don't mean to depress you.
So 2 questions. Perhaps, so Millicent is asking about your thoughts on the ACDC, the African Center for Disease Control, that is trying, in her words, to play the role of access and facilitate access for Africa. What is your opinion on how the African Center for Disease Control should play this role? And second, well, let's answer that one first.
So I think obviously all of us would expect the CDC to, we're all going to say they should do more and they should do harder, but I think they operating within an ecosystem where it's impossible for them to demand more than they can, right? So they're dealing with issues around attacks on their own legitimacy and their credibility and the purpose and the point of science and evidence. And so you're fighting for your survival, and you're also trying to expand access. So I think they're doing the best within their mandate, within their resources, within how they've been established. As an activist, do I think they're doing enough? Are they really pushing the envelope? No, because I think this pandemic gave us one opportunity and one chance to really push the envelope. Could they do more? Are they, and I think that's a question for the South African government as well. So are institutions agreeing to things too quickly and without considering all the different applications? So we're so eager to get dosages and to expand access, but are we looking at the prior agreements? Are we looking at the longevity? Are we looking at what it means for trying to build manufacturing capacity? Because I think it's moving so fast that everybody's trying to chase their tails. But I think the officials there are really trying to do their best. I mean, I can't fault them for not working hard enough. But I think, like most institutions, like the WHO, like UNAIDS, they are crippled or they're held hostage. I think held hostage is probably the better term. They're held hostage by very powerful global interests that are backed by the pharmaceutical industry. And those global interests, remember, are also from governments. I think the role that some of the EU countries, the role that the UK, the Johnson administration and the Trump administration have been playing is not a very positive one, because there is a nationalism. There is a sort of tendency to hoard. There is a tendency, and we've seen it with advanced purchasing agreements. So, you know, I don't envy them. I thought, you know, if I worked there, what would I do and what would I do differently? But I want to come back to, we can't put all our, I want to come back to the CDC, because I think they play a specific important scientific role around science and evidence. They are not our government. They are not our elected officials. They are not the ones that we can hold accountable, right? We can critique them, we can offer insight, whatever, but ultimately we have to hold our governments to account. And we have to hold other governments to account when, in the rare cases that our government locally tries to actually do something that's positive, that's going to expand access, is then prevented from doing so by vested interests of other countries. And so the solidarity issues, you talked about similarities with HIV/AIDS. I think the solidarity between countries in the South and the North has to re-emerge. And so something like Free the Vaccine, the people's vaccine, are important small steps in trying to get international solidarity and activists from other parts of the world to help us with making some of these more hyper-local demands.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Fatima. So Ntando's asking, how well organized and equipped are we to be able to demand all of these things from our government? And he ends off with, I find an interesting statement. In fact, who are we?
Are we?
In my mother's words, where do we get off demanding these things from our government? What do we have that allows us to have the chest and the liver to stand and make these demands? Who are we, Fatima?
Yeah, so this is what people used to ask us in HIV/AIDS, but who are you? You're a bunch of lawyers and activists, and well, what right do you have? And so I think I think that's a good question, but I think what we have to figure out is how do we center, and it sounds like a flimsy word, but how do we center communities and people who are most affected by ill health, most affected by HIV, by TB, by COVID. And that's actually everybody, as citizens. So I don't mean citizens in the narrow word, in the narrow sense where it's used in xenophobic framework. So I mean citizen as in we are all part of some system. We all belong in some country. Some of us have the privilege of being able to vote. Some of us live in countries where there hasn't even been a free and fair election for many years. So I think the who we are has to be the people who try and protect the rights of those who are most vulnerable and marginalized. Because I think what's going to happen is that when the allocation process starts, who's going to stand up for people living with HIV? Who's going to stand up for the sex worker? Who's going to stand up for the refugee and the asylum seeker and the migrant? So I think we've got very limited time to figure out our global solidarity strategies and our local solidarity strategies. I've also been struggling to say, well, how do we create a community of people who are going to make demands? How do we get that same sense of solidarity that we had with HIV/AIDS and that we've seen on TB or we've seen with cancer? Because, there's issues around the interaction between COVID and a lot of these other diseases. So I think the who we are is, I certainly feel in South Africa, the who we are is I'm a South African who has elected this government into power and it must now serve me. Because my health is totally dependent on government at the moment. And then its ability to navigate the very complex vested interests of industry and of other governments in geopolitical, because I don't have the right to go and appear before the WTO and negotiate. My government does. And I know that it's difficult for people in other parts of Africa or other parts of the global South because they may not be those systems. But I think, we have to really think hard about why we would think we don't have the legitimacy to make these demands. So I know in South Africa, I certainly can make those demands because the Constitution allows me to, right? And so I think the framework, and that's, a lot of people have been writing about it globally, this framework of global health, of moving away from health as a commodity, of centering human rights as part of our health response, not just to COVID, but generally to all other epidemics and pandemics as well. That's what we need to elevate. I mean, there's other elements of how do we decolonize global health, but I think over time we'll get to that. So, I started off with the Constitution in Section 27, but I really think even if we weren't living in a country with a Constitution, the centering of human rights and of human dignity, I think in this whole equation has to be paramount and has to be central. The pushback, and I think the challenge that we're going to have is while we're trying to promote a rights agenda, what we're seeing is a market agenda. The market must self-regulate, the market will determine pricing, the market there has to be a reasonable return on profit. So as with HIV/AIDS, I think the profit agenda, and that's who they are, so they feel certainly entitled to be pushing a particular agenda, who they are saying, the market will determine, we've invested all this money in these trials, and let's come back to research and development and government funding, Tian. But their argument is we've invested all this money, we're entitled to a profit, hard luck for you, we'll give you a bit of free supplies for maybe 1 year until the declaration by the WHO is lifted. I mean, the Financial Times got access to an agreement that AstraZeneca had signed, which actually talked about July 2021, right? And so there has to be a counterforce. And I think it's the old question then of when we actually make these demands and articulate these demands, there are times when we'll be in opposition to government, and there are times when we will be in support of government. So I'm going to support my government when it says those things in Geneva, but I'm not going to support what it's doing here or what it's not doing here, right? So let's just circle back to the R&D, and then I can take the next question. There's a myth, and I think our job, we have to expose those myths. And MSF has done some fantastic research and reports on this. Another organization called IMEC has done it. KEI has done this to show that there is an assumption which we need to address in each one of our countries, that only the pharmaceutical industry put their money on the table, that only the pharmaceutical company spent millions of dollars on research and development, when the truth is actually something different, right? Governments have been putting public money in the US, in the UK, in other parts of the world into these trials. And those figures are often public, and sometimes you have to actually, fight to get access to that information. We found out that our government has put 10 million rands into the AstraZeneca trial. But who's going to decide access and who's going to decide pricing? AstraZeneca. But we're putting our researchers, our institutions, our trial participants, and we put in money that could have been maybe used for social grants, but we're not guaranteed, indefinite, affordable access. So I think there's a lot of stuff around who the we are and how do we play a role in actually exposing a lot of these myths, in actually creating the solidarity wherever these trials are happening, to say to the Brazilian activists, what are you finding out? To say to the UK and US activists, what are you finding out? And already, which is quite interesting, is that the UK and the US have got activists who started demanding access to all the funding details, to all the access agreements. We in a country which has this great constitution and great access to information laws and all these briefings and this whole MAC and whole infrastructure around dealing with COVID, nobody's seen the agreement between AstraZeneca and the Oxford group. And we don't know what the terms are. And we partnered with an institute at the Oxford University. And so we learned from media reports, not even official government communications, that there are 2 South African shareholders, very prominent ones, businesses, who are shareholders of the Oxford group. So, there's so much work to be done, and unfortunately we can't just rely on a handful of investigative journalists and a group of civil society to be pushing this demand for transparency. And just on the final point of the transparency, this is the beginning, Tian. If we push for transparency in the early stages of how we manage this pandemic, it's going to be with us for years. Then at least we make some headway so that in 5 years' time, in 7 years' time, in 10 years' time, we know a lot more than we actually do, from the last 7 months.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've answered your question, but
I think you have, and it's really compelling to listen to. Fatima, so one of the issues, a bit away now from vaccines, etc., which I think is really a foundational issue that we've struggled with and certainly spoken about in these calls. You know, we spoke to Sibongile Chabalala from TAC about it. We spoke to Babelane from the COVID constituency about it. Is this issue that Phumzile really raises in the chat, which I think is really, the backstory there is really powerful. So once we have this package of demands, right, as civil society organizations, etc., that we want to make to government, surely these demands would come across with a lot more weight, a lot more integrity, a lot more authority, if we had the fabled, in my view, united civil society. What are your thoughts in terms of the current state of South African civil society, especially since the advent of COVID, and how divisions where they exist, opposing views where they exist, how do we work in this context to get everyone on the same page? Do we need to get everyone on the same page? Perhaps not. But how do we find our point, which I imagine is a similar struggle that was had during the struggle for treatment? How do we get this critical mass of civil society together with this singular focus, if that's the desire, to back all of these demands that we intend making or are making?
Sure, these are tough questions. So, I mean, I think we had this in HIV/AIDS. There's no one voice. And in HIV/AIDS, it was more difficult because we were seen as the outliers. We were seen as the troublemakers. You know, everybody now, it's like apartheid. Everybody was opposed to apartheid. Now all of a sudden, everybody supported TAC, and they were all on our side, and they all believed in our demand. It wasn't the case. We were accused of being unpatriotic, of not being supportive of the ANC government. We were accused of taking money from drug companies, and that's why we were pushing ARVs. So it was, you know, the revisionist history about what happened in those 10 years is very sometimes interesting to read, because we had a lot of civil society people actually not supporting what we were saying. And I think the challenge is, if you know that something is right and you can back it up with the science and evidence, even if you're the lone voice, you have to say it and you have to do that work. So it was a real struggle in that time, which was complicated by the fact that government was using other NGOs and civil society to undermine us deliberately. I mean, we only found that out years later. They'd infiltrated those organizations, they were giving them funding. So there was an issue around some of the NGOs were actually the henchmen, right, of a denialist government. They didn't want us to promote access to ARVs, and they didn't want us to change government policies. I think that's different now. I think it's much easier in civil society that has, you know, it's fantastic. I spent 6 years at a foundation trying to support and build up civil society, and you just see the breadth and depth of it. So we have so many organizations, and they can very easily spot something that is actually a front for a pharmaceutical interest or for a government interest. Because when you work on these issues, you're not just dealing with the potential of an organization that is pushing a pro-government agenda, where that agenda is not favorable to poor people or people who are sick, right? But you also have organizations that are pushing a particular market or pharmaceutical interest agenda. And so that's the difficulty. So I don't think we'll ever speak with one voice. And I think that's important, as long as all of our different voices are still rooted in science and evidence. So, Tian, you may have a different view about government should invest the money in hand masks, in face masks. And I may say, no, they should invest the money in vaccines. But that's okay to have that difference of opinion, because we're still both rooting our arguments in science and evidence. What is an intervention that can actually work? I think the difference is when your voice is something totally, you know, not rooted in science and evidence, and I'm saying, and I've got to call that out, and nobody in civil society likes to call each other out, and I think that's the problem. But I think what we are blessed with, and you know, I've always said this for many years, is that in South Africa in particular, because of all of the issues around state capture, because of the issues around our failing health system, the inequities, our apartheid past, issues around it, we have so many amazing organizations and people working on principles of accountability, principles of transparency. And it's no longer about, I don't think at least, obviously we have a race and gender problem in civil society in South Africa, and we don't have enough transformation, but it's less based on what your race, gender, sexual orientation is, and therefore your criticism either has more value or less value. So I think the challenge for us as civil society, or as human rights lawyers, or as human rights activists, whatever we want to call ourselves, science activists, you know, community organizers, is that how do we, with so much happening around COVID and the goalposts keep shifting and so much, I mean, I don't know if you can keep up with all the medical literature that's coming out. I can't. So it's moving very fast. Like Linda Gale-Becker says, it's unprecedented. They've never had this for any medical condition. Is how do we keep true to speaking truth to power, but doing it based on an evidence basis, right? Sorry, the other question was around, yeah, if we do articulate a set of demands. So I think as many different voices as possible. I think what we did with the HIV AIDS was that there was sort of like an agreement. You focus on the testing campaign and we'll focus on the medicine prices and you focus on that. And because collectively, many different interventions and voices also puts pressure on government because they're just gonna get an avalanche of questioning. And so sometimes it's useful, it's the old thing of how do you organize. Sometimes it's useful that we all organize on one campaign together, and sometimes it's useful that all 10 organizations are separately trying to articulate the same set of demands. I mean, I think what's useful about the Free the Vaccine campaign is that that really is a global, organic collection of different organizations and individuals that are trying to say we need a global set of demands around vaccine access and vaccine transparency and accountability. It was similar to the work that you're doing with VAG. The People's Vaccine is a bit of a different initiative. So you want to kind of participate in it to an extent, but also observe it because it has a lot of government leaders, right? And it also has like multilateral institutions like UNAIDS. So I think there is the potential, to answer your question, to build a strong civil society collective. But because of COVID, people are tired, there's fatigue, there is no funding, or funders are just making our lives very difficult, which I think is an issue we all need to deal with as organizations that are donor funded, particularly because of the pandemic. And I think people also have, I don't know, you know, I think HIV/AIDS really, that struggle really tired people. And so this possibility that, oh my God, we're going to have to do this for another 10 years and still fight another access battle, and then there'll be another pandemic and another, and this is just going to go on indefinitely. I think that is also the thing that maybe is tiring people. So yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do, and I do believe that we can find consensus. We don't necessarily have to speak with one voice, but I think there is room to find consensus. And the thing that heartens me now is that a lot more people are talking about the issues that we were only talking about in HIV/AIDS, and people thought we were insane. They were like, well, no, a drug company can charge whatever it wants to. And now people realize how a simple issue of a price of a medicine can be the difference between life and death. And that for me, I think is something we should leverage. It's quite significant.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Fatima. So Fatima, in the last 5 minutes, time flies when you're having fun. So
5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 minutes to the hour. So Fatima, this group that collaborates and hosts these calls, all of the groupings that I mentioned at the outset, consists of trade unions, healthcare worker movements, women's rights movements, the financial sector, NEDLAC coalitions. What are the low-hanging, is there low-hanging fruit? What are the actions, the practical, doable actions, if there's one, that we could all do immediately after this call, in the next week, in the next month, that would contribute to this discussion and discourse and advocacy around transparency, accountability, and community ownership of vaccine research? Is there one particular action that stands out in your mind as a call to action for this group?
I think there's a few calls. I've been waiting for this one. The one is, I think, Tian, we need to demand, like, enough now. We need to demand a seat with government at that table with the MAC, right, with the different MAC processes, and to have some kind of regular community dialogues with the National Department of Health. So I think a lot of decisions are being taken on a scientific basis, which is good, but it's not taking into account inequality. So the socioeconomic context of our country is not being factored into the decisions around whether it's trials or whether it's medical treatment protocols or screening protocols or any of those issues. So a seat at the table of many different government engagements that are currently underway, which we just excluded from. And so I don't know how you get the voice of people who are most affected. You know, it's different with HIV/AIDS because there we had people living with HIV, and so in South Africa we don't have an alliance of people living with COVID or people who have recovered from COVID. It's very different, right? So what we need is people who are interested in health justice and health equity, because the response to the management of COVID is having an impact on our entire healthcare system. And so I think we have a legitimate right to be asking for a seat. The second, I think, in each of your organizations or as individuals is to say, where is the transparency on the trials? You know, transparency is not telling me that a trial is happening with 240 participants in this part of the country. That's not transparency, that's just details. So where are the access agreements? Where are the pre-access agreements? What have you seen? What have you signed away? You know, there's a whole, I can give you a list of 20 questions that need to be asked to all those institutions that are hosting those trials, including our government. And I think for VAG in particular, you have to, the low-hanging fruit is, well, the thing that concerns me the most is the WHO has already put out a framework for allocation, right? Which is supposed to prioritize the most vulnerable groups in any country and in any local setting. There's two problems with the allocation framework. Is we're assuming we'll get a limited number of dosages. So where are we going to get those dosages from, et cetera, because even with COVAX, we've just done a non-binding agreement. I don't think we've put money in as yet. And in the absence of issuing a compulsory license, you're basically going to be relying on charity, right? And relying on benevolence and relying on donations from other more wealthier countries. So assuming we can deal with patents, licensing, manufacturing capacity, which is like a whole big question mark. I don't know who's going to manufacture the vaccines in Africa, in Latin America. That's a huge concern. So investment should rather, I think, be in manufacturing capacity, not in SAA, but that's my personal view, right? It's also about prioritization and allocation of resources in the bigger economic framework. But what is going to be the allocation plan? You know, who's going to be front of the line? How is it going to be rolled out? Alongside, we think, a potential rolling out of the NHI. So the allocation plan, the allocation framework, the principles, the priorities, I think is important. It's not enough, with all due respect to all of those amazing people who I love and I've worked with before on the MAC and the different MACs. I mean, these are all very committed people, but these discussions can't be happening behind closed doors. We need a chance to be able to influence that. The other low-hanging fruit is Parliament. What is Parliament doing, Tian? How many briefings have they had? What, you know, no, man. So that health committee, I'm sorry, needs to ramp up. I think as civil society, we need to be making demands to the chairperson of the health committee to say, you need to play your oversight role, not just a support role. You need to hold the executive to account. I think we need more regular briefings in Parliament around the vaccine aspects, around IP aspects, around diagnostic aspects. We need full details. We can't rely on opposition parties to be asking these questions to, you know, that's the only way to get answers. I mean, when the disaster is no longer in place, and that could be the 16th of November because it was extended to the 15th, then we need to ramp up and I think scale up our ability to hold the executive to account, and Parliament needs to be, you know, playing their part in that. So that's 4 low-hanging fruit, sorry.
Yeah. Great. Well, it is the top of the hour. Thank you so much for taking an hour out to chat with us. Thank you everybody on the call who has also joined us. Colleagues, Fatima Hassan is the founder and the head of the Health Justice Initiative. And hopefully this call is the beginning of many others as we work together to find solutions. And we will share with you all of the social media handles and Facebook platforms. Follow us all. We're launching our new website shortly, where all of these videos and transcripts and Q&As will be available to watch at your leisure. So Fatima, thank you again for joining us this Thursday, and we look forward to more interactions with you. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.